Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Swampfox Sentinel RDS. The Sentinel is yet another option for what I call the micro RDS category, meaning a red dot sight primarily intended for a handgun, and even then intended for smaller or slimmer handguns, such as a Glock 48, SIG P365, Springfield Hellcat, in that general category. So it's a smaller red dot sight intended for smaller carry guns, compact, subcompact. Doesn't mean you can't put it on a larger gun, but just my personal opinion, and sometimes the manufacturer will say this as well, not intended for those larger guns, which means it's probably not intended for a quote-unquote duty carry, a uniform carry, an exposed carry, an open carry, if you will. Optics that are a little bit more likely to encounter the environment a little bit more. So more of a mind towards concealed carry, everyday carry. My RDS testing protocol, however, does not differentiate. I kind of had to make a decision, not just for video purposes, because I don't video every single optic I test, and I test a lot of optics 2, 3, 4, 5 times. The only time I'll do a video update on the second or the third or the fourth is if something changes or something improves or a new model or whatever. But I had to decide if I was going to change my testing protocol, and as you guys know, watching other videos, such as other videos that I've done on the micro red dot sight category, you know that I didn't change anything. However, there is one difference, and that's the fact that I'm going to be using a Glock 48 MOS for the test, so there won't be a burn down, just because I do not have, nor am I going to purchase enough shield arms / Glock magazines in order to do 500 rounds at a go out of what I consider to be a very small, very snappy little gun. Just don't really see the value in necessarily doing that. And you may take issue with that, but my testing protocol, so that's the way I'm doing it. So the only thing that really changes is there is no actual burn down, but there is still going to be 2,000 rounds, hopefully. Now, getting into the features of the Sentinel, it is a 7075 aluminum bodied RDS. There are two variants to the Sentinel. One of is an always on or an auto brightness, and then there's a manual brightness with a shake awake option, which helps preserve your long-term battery life. The particular model I reviewed has a 3 MOA point of aim, which I consider to be a reasonable dot size, especially considering on these micro RDS sights, and the Sentinel's no different. You are getting a relatively smaller window than what you get for some of the larger full-size handgun optics. The Sentinel has 10 illumination settings for brightness, which is very helpful depending on the lighting conditions that you're in, be it low light or bright sunlight. It's nice to have enough options, and I found throughout the review process that the dot brightness was really good. Now, Sentinel uses the RMSC footprint, which has kind of become the unofficial footprint for your smaller micro red dot sights. And they also quote the parallax, which I find really different. And what I see from some of the other companies is Swampfox is telling you right up front, this optic is parallax free at a distance, where some optic manufacturers just use the term of near parallax free, or they just say go ahead and say parallax free. There's always going to be some kind of alignment or focus parallax present in a red dot sight. It's nice for Swampfox to go ahead and put that out there. Now, as far as getting into just the features of it, you've got very intuitive and I think really well designed brightness adjustment buttons. And usually the buttons are something that we don't put a lot of thought into unless we notice something wrong with them. I've reviewed optics in the past where the button was way too pronounced, and inadvertent contact with the environment could cause my optic to get brighter or dimmer, which is not something I want. I've got a brightness setting on one side of the optic and then a brightness setting on the other. Me being left-handed, holsters usually negatively interfere with stuff like that, just because the holster sits and compresses differently against the gun, and most optics are designed with the controls for a right-handed shooter. This one isn't necessarily any different, but it kind of is, because I've got 50% of my up and 50% of my down, you know, left, right, whatever you want to say. Carrying it concealed, didn't have any inadvertent issues with those buttons. I think they're well placed. Even if I have a holster that has a very high sweat guard that comes up and makes contact with that optic body, I didn't have my brightness change on me. The glass clarity is really good. There's very minimal distortion, especially at the edges of the window. It's something we always want to check, see how much distortion is present in our lens, and it doesn't really have a noticeable notch filter, that bluish tint that some optics have, which is there on purpose to help preserve long-term battery life, because it limits certain spectrums of lights from coming through the optic, so you don't have to turn the red dot up as high to see it. But I didn't see a lot of distortion throughout the process. Now, Setting out, I was going to do my normal 2,000 round review process, which is includes, and this is what a lot of people are concerned with, a drop test every 500 rounds. Now, even though no burn down was going to take place on this optic, just in general in my testing, I've moved the burn down to the second 500 round block, just in case the optic breaks on its first drop. So the old way, if I zeroed it and immediately did a drop test on it, or immediately did the burn down and then did a drop test on it and it broke, the only real feel I got for the optic was that 500 rounds as quickly as possible at one target. So I don't do that anymore. Now it's moved. So the first 500 rounds is just me getting a feel for the optic, and it's probably how I should have been doing it the whole time. Apologize for that, but we live and we learn. One thing that definitely stood out about the Sentinel is it's got a really good high quality red dot. It doesn't have a lot of flicker to it, really none at all, and it is true to size in varied lighting conditions. And unlike some of the other Swampfox optics I've looked at, I didn't get a lot of reflective light bouncing through. If you remember from the video that I did on, I believe it was the Liberty, depending on where I was aiming in relation to the sun, I'd have like a refraction effect where I'd get some bounce back from the actual emitter window, and that would project and present inside my optic window while I was shooting through it. Sentinel doesn't do that. I don't know if that's because it's a different emitter or it's different lens quality, different lens composition, different notch filter, whatever, but it's not something that I experienced, and I purposely tried to see if I could replicate that because I figure maybe all their optics do it, and that's not the case. That wasn't something that I experienced. As far as the optic construction goes, I was a little apprehensive, like I am about all optics that are this size. Now, having it mounted on a full-size gun, there's a lot more weight going there. For drop test, might be a little more potentially damaging. Carrying it on the 48, I'm going to do my drop tests on a loaded Glock 48, which weighs less than say a loaded Glock 17. But the concern is still there because the optic lends itself more to being more fragile because there's just less material involved in construction, and optic manufacturers have to avoid infringing on other optic manufacturers' patents when they design their shrouds. And the shroud is where you make or break an optic, literally. So certain designs, even though they'd be more beneficial from a structural standpoint, can't be done because someone else already got a patent on it. So in that first 500 rounds, I was able to get a really good feel for the optic. I feel like it's a good red dot as far as performance goes. Didn't have any issues with battery drain or flickering or loss of zero just from recoil. I did work in some one-handed manipulations, which is something that I do because people are going to do it. Only time I'd advocate, like I pretty much say every video I do on a red dot, advocate manipulating the optic against a hard surface in order to work the slide, is if your other hand just isn't available. So it's kind of a wounded shooting drill, if you will, or your other hand's occupied. Maybe you're carrying a kid or something like that. So some worst case scenario type stuff, but we've been teaching people how to manipulate guns one-handed since guns. So this is something that I definitely include in the testing because there's no reason not to, in that quote-unquote emergency situation, to manipulate off that optic. And I'm happy to find it didn't affect the zero and it didn't cause any damage to the lens when manipulating the optic body off of various surfaces. And then we get to the drop test. And that's it. And that's pretty much the end of it right there. It broke on the first drop, which I kind of expected. Does this mean this is a bad optic? No. And this is just one metric of my testing process, and I kind of anguish over it a little bit, thinking maybe I should have different testing protocol for an optic that the majority of people wouldn't consider carrying on a duty gun. And then I think about, well, goalposts are goalposts, and there's other micro red dot sights that can meet the standards that I set up for duty testing, so maybe they all should, at least in my opinion, because it is my testing. You can obviously seek out other people who do optic testing and kind of say, well, I like their testing protocol better, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, I'm going to keep testing every red dot sight I test to the same standards just because it makes life a little bit easier for me, and it avoids the nuance that we may get into where people say, well, different testing protocol, different opinion, which would be completely honest. Is it a bad optic? No. Is it an optic that I personally would put on a carry gun? Also, no. And that's just because the goalposts are the goalposts. I would rather have an optic that can handle the abuse than one that cannot. Now, what's the likelihood of a concealed carry optic encountering those kind of forces? I don't know. And it's something I continually have to reiterate to people, because sometimes people just don't want to hear it, is the drop test is not because I believe you're going to physically lose the grip on your gun and it's going to fall from a traditional presentation shoulder height. The drop test is to simulate a lot of force being delivered to the optic that's within the realm of realism. I regularly hear back from my alumni instructors that I teach in my Red Dot handgun instructor course, and they tell me about optics that have been broken in the line of duty in the field, and sometimes the gun isn't even out of the holster when it occurs. So I like my goalposts, and if an optic can't meet my goalposts, if it can't handle all of the testing protocol, including the drop tests, it's not something I would necessarily use or recommend. That doesn't mean that Swampfox hasn't improved on their optic quality, because from the last Swampfox optic reviewed, I talked a lot about that optic compared to previous, or first generation, if you will, Swampfox optics that I checked out, like the Kingslayer. I believe that there is definite room for improvement, and I will say that if I was going to compare this optic to other optics in the same category, which I don't do comparison reviews, but just bringing it up, it's holding the line above some of the other stuff that's out there, and even more popular because it's been around longer. But longevity does not equal quality. If there's only one optic in a category and everybody for some reason wants to go for that size optic, then if there's only one option, then everybody's gonna be like, well, I'll just accept it. Now you don't have to. We've got some really good competition evolving in that micro red dot category, where a lot of people are moving toward for higher capacity, smaller or single stack guns. This optic, I feel like, is going to get better with future generations, and I feel like they have a really good start. But at this time, and this iteration, or this generation, this is not something I personally would recommend to anyone for concealed carry. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.